And I think it goes back to something profound that you said support people where they are, not where you think they should be. And I think that's quite important for everyone to know, because it helps in terms of not invalidating a person's feelings.
If you could mobilize a group of people, what movement would you mobilize and why?
I would call my movement the mindful movement. Suicide is one of the leading causes of death between people aged 15 and 29. 1 in 3 people are expected to suffer from mental illnesses in their lifetime. So I believe that mobilizing people to strive for mental health would actually fix so many social ills in our society. And that is what I would mobilize.
Okay, I can hear you as well. Yes, I can now.
Okay, perfect. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Shudu. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Thanks so much for having me this evening.
Thank you so much for coming through. I think this is quite an important topic, because a lot of people are going through this, but then if you don't have a name for it, if you don't know the symptoms or where to get help, then it becomes a very difficult thing to go through. So I think it's quite important for us to engage in it, especially with the things and the recent events in this country and just COVID in general. So yeah, I'm ready to get into it. So today we're going to be talking about trauma and PTSD. I just wanted to ask you, how do I say your name properly? Like, it was bothering me a bit because I thought I wasn't saying it properly.
It's Reabetsoe.
Reabetsoe, there we go, Reabetsoe. So yeah, thank you for that clarification. So in terms of trauma and PTSD, the very first question that I had was, what's the difference between the two? Because I find that people use it interchangeably, but then I'm sure there is a difference between the two.
No, definitely. So, I mean, if we start off with trauma usually refers to a specific event. So trauma will be something specific that happened. So an example would be someone being assaulted, a car accident, a hijacking. So it's an event that occurs, whereas PTSD is usually a longer term condition that develops as a result of trauma. So the traumatic event happens, and that is associated with various symptoms and reactions, but then later on PTSD can develop if the trauma isn't dealt with, then the person re-experiences the trauma. So trauma is the event, and PTSD is a longer condition that tends to happen after the trauma has occurred.
So someone is asking, what does PTSD stand for? It is post-traumatic stress disorder, correct?
Yes, it's post-traumatic stress disorder. So the post-traumatic is because it usually happens after the trauma occurs.
Okay. And then I think you touched on the causes of trauma and PTSD. What are, do you mind just clarifying them again, what the causes of trauma and PTSD are?
So traumatic events range, right? And what I find traumatic may be very different from what you find traumatic. So usual causes of trauma are things like domestic violence, for one, can cause trauma, because a trauma is defined by something that is life-threatening, something that is a threat either to yourself or a threat to somebody else. So actually witnessing some kind of threat can also be traumatic to you. So domestic violence, car accidents, hijackings, being assaulted, being robbed. Trauma also relates to things like natural disasters. So in areas of the world where they have hurricanes and floods and all those kinds of things, those things can also be traumatic, because essentially there's a threat to somebody's life or, their livelihood, to the environment in some way. We often associate PTSD with like soldiers that have been to war and they, come back and they experience post-trauma symptoms as well. So it's usually something that is life-threatening and something that is potentially threatening to someone else also.
So let's say someone is watching this and thinking to themselves, I'm going through something like this. At what point do you know that you need to get help? Because like you're saying with PTSD, it's over like a longer period. So when should someone get help? When should someone go to seek professional help?
So I think, firstly, it's important to understand that there will be a reaction to trauma, right? So there will be a response. Because it is life-threatening, we have those physical responses, we do have those psychological responses. So that is normal as a result of a traumatic situation. But I think when someone notices that they are really not okay, in that they are not able to do the things that they usually do, so they're not able to go back to work or function at work the way that they used to, if they are not able to sleep, if they're not able to eat properly, if they're not able to do what they would normally do, and it's causing quite a significant impact just on their lifestyle, their health, their well-being, their relationships with other people, it's really important then to consider speaking to someone that can help you to navigate how to process the trauma and move on from it. So when it's interfering with your normal day-to-day life, that's probably an indication that you should speak to someone that can help you.
Okay. And a lot of people, in as much as you spoke about the causes of PTSD, what are the symptoms? Like, what symptoms should a loved one look for, even like yourself? How do you know that you're suffering from PTSD?
So I think it is when, so like I just said now, when things change and you're just not able to do things the way that you would normally do. So if you are finding that your mood is just not what it should be. And I think we all have the capacity to assess ourselves. So if you know that there is something that's just not right, I think you'll be able to pick it up and feel it, right? So mood changes in sleeping. So a lot of people will struggle to sleep. They won't be able to sleep at all, or they sleep and they wake up in the middle of the night after night after night. People find that their appetite changes, so they don't really eat very well, or they eat more than they usually would. People will find that they just feel quite numb and quite disassociated in different instances in their lives. Family members, friends will pick up that, no man, but that person's not okay. They're not usually like this. And just aspects, I suppose, that indicate that there's some kind of destabilization that's going on, just not being your normal self, and finding that it's affecting all areas of somebody's life is usually an indication that there's something going on that should probably be resolved.
And we live in a world where there's so many things on social media and so many things just in general in the media that are quite traumatic. Can someone suffer from trauma or PTSD or something of that nature through social media or something that they've seen? Can someone struggle with trauma because of something like that?
Yes, so you bring up a very important point. It's actually called secondary trauma. So that is when we see and we hear about trauma happening around us. So if someone comes to you and says, they broke into my house and they did this and that, you can get traumatized just from hearing that story. So you can imagine all of the things that we hear all the time from the news, from newspapers, on social media. There's always something going on, and people can definitely get traumatized from just seeing and hearing quite distressing, threatening situations that are happening to other people that can cause secondary trauma. And I think we're not always aware of how traumatized we can become from the things that we see every day, the things that we hear every day, the stories that we tell each other. They can definitely be traumatizing.
And like you're saying, you can suffer from secondary trauma and trauma just in general. But I wanted to find out, people often react differently to trauma. Some freeze, some talk about being numb. Can you explain the fight or flight response?
Okay, so I'm sure a lot of people have heard about it, and I think we do use it, that, I went into fight or flight. So essentially it is a physiological response, and it's an instinctual response. So it happens mainly in our bodies. So that is when we perceive a threat, so we're in a threatening situation, and your body prepares itself to survive, and it prepares itself to protect itself. So when somebody, let's say, is walking down the street and there is a group of unsavory looking characters coming towards them, they automatically, your heart starts beating faster, you start to shake, you start to sweat, your body is physically preparing itself to protect itself. And what then happens is, and I suppose it differs from person to person, either your body is preparing itself to fight, so to actually physically protect itself and to, do what it needs to do in order to stave off the attack, or flight, which is also protective. You are removing yourself from the potential trauma, from the threat that it is that has presented itself. So usually it's not even something that we think about. It's an automatic response. It kicks in to protect us. Your adrenaline gets going, and you basically do what you need to do in order to survive. Essentially, that's what it is, the survival response.
And do children react differently to traumas in comparison to adults?
So there are a lot of similarities, in terms of obviously just feeling quite shaken, and disturbed. And a lot of adults will describe that they feel, quite confused afterwards, because your thinking about the world changes, when something happens that you were not expecting. So trauma is usually unexpected. And as I said, it's life-threatening. So it causes a lot of confusion and a lot of sadness, because now your view of things and your view of the world has changed. So those similarities happen with children, where they will feel quite sad, they'll feel quite confused. But in children, we normally notice behavioral changes. So they will not be who they usually are. So if you usually have quite a, lively and bubbly child, they may become a little bit reserved. Some children become aggressive, because there's so many overwhelming emotions, and they don't understand what's happening. They know that something bad happened. They are having all of these thoughts and all these feelings, but they can't make sense of it. So sometimes they do show a little bit more irritability and aggression, and they will usually show changes in their habits, so they, like a child will go from being very happy to sleep in their room to not wanting to sleep alone at all, and wanting to now sleep with their mom or their dad, or they will be very clingy, or they will not want to go to school, or they'll fight with friends. So it's usually quite significant changes that you'll notice in a child's behavior, that indicates that they're also quite affected by a traumatic situation.
So we live in a country, especially now that you're speaking about kids and traumatic events, and you spoke about domestic violence earlier. We live in a country with alarming rates of gender-based violence. A lot of people have been through a lot. And now with COVID on top of it, people have lost loved ones, lost jobs. If someone is struggling with PTSD from such events, or even something else, what treatment options are available for them?
So fortunately, there are quite a few options that people can consider. So usually I think, we all speak about, no, but just go for trauma counseling, just go for therapy. So seeing a professional can just help you make sense of what's happening. And from my experience, what usually helps with trauma, that first thing that people do is to just understand what they're going through, to know that, I'm actually traumatized, because often people don't realize that they're as traumatized as they are. So therapy helps you to understand what's happening to you, first of all, and then to process the trauma, and that is done in many different ways, and then to build up those strategies and build up those coping skills that assist you with regards to managing the after effects of the trauma, and also preventing it from becoming a post-traumatic stress disorder. So counseling is usually really helpful. Like I said, the problems with the sleeping and the eating and all of that, it may be advisable for them to also go on a short period of just taking medication that is going to help your body to physically deal with the effects of the trauma. So if you're not really coping physically, it might be a good idea to see somebody that can assist with something that can help the body to recover from the trauma as well. There's also support groups, there are a lot of different ways in which someone can get the support that they need in order to deal with a traumatic event, and obviously the implications and the consequences of that.
And I'm sure there are people watching this thinking to themselves, they don't have access to any of those things, there's some places or areas where therapy is basically a luxury or something that can't even think about, or even counseling or support groups. There are a lot of issues of accessibility and affordability in this country. So what self-help tips can you give that person who's watching right now, who knows they need help, but they can't really access help?
So, I think it's really important to just educate yourself. So obviously not overindulging in what is online regarding, trauma and what it is and how I can cope with it, etc. Because there tends to be a lot of different things out there and a lot of information. But I think, just trying to get a sense of what's going on and understanding. Also maintaining a routine. So usually when we're traumatized, we go out of routine. So you end up, because now you can't sleep, then you end up not sleeping at all. So now you stay up the whole night, now that because you don't feel like eating, then you don't eat at all, So it's very important to just go back into a normal routine. Do the things that you would usually do, outside of what had happened. Also just reaching out, speaking to loved ones, making sure that you're resting, making sure that you are, doing a little bit of exercise, anything that's going to help your body to also recover. Because remember, when you go through a trauma, your body goes into shock, right? That fight or flight I was talking about is basically your body going into shock, and that physical response kicking in. To recover, it also helps you psychologically and emotionally to also have the resources that you need to recover.
So
and I think a lot of times when we don't find it easy to talk to people, it can help to also just write it down, just to let out your thoughts and your feelings and put it down onto paper, so that your brain does process it. If you're just sitting and not saying anything and not doing anything with that information, it doesn't go anywhere. But as soon as you let it out, you can start to make sense of it to some extent as well.
I'm so glad that you spoke about writing it down, because for the past few weeks on Mindful Mondays, every single clinical psychologist or professional that comes on speaks about the importance of journaling. I'm a firm believer in that as well, where you relinquish power from whatever's bothering you if you put it down on paper. The whole point is to get it out, and I'm glad that it applies to trauma and PTSD, because I think, especially like we were talking about the issues of affordability and accessibility, it's quite important for people to know that journaling and just getting it out is the most important thing, making sense of it yourself, because sometimes you just need to make sure that your thoughts actually make sense and that they're validated somehow, and sometimes reading it out loud can go a long way. So thank you so much for that. I have a few questions from the audience. Someone was talking about being someone was talking about they were robbed a few months back. They were petrified and they froze. And when they think about it, they get so angry at themselves because they didn't fight back, or they didn't run away or put up a fight. Every single time when they walk to work, every single man that walks past them, they think they want to rob them. Does this feeling ever go away? That's the question that I got.
True, and I think that's one of those things where it's so easy for us to always, at that moment you really did what you felt was best in order to survive, right? So it was just an immediate response. You did what you needed to do, and it's not always easy to think very clearly in those situations. That feeling does hang around for a while, and that's what trauma does, is that it takes a couple of weeks, sometimes even months, for you to not have those feelings, but doing what you need to do in order to understand what happened. So understand that, I'm actually traumatized, I'm actually going through a lot. What would help me is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. After some time, doing those things actually helps to alleviate some of those symptoms. But it's very common to, think I should have done this, that, and the other, and also to then have those triggers. So, walking down that same road brings up those same emotions because your body thinks it's going to happen again. So you end up having a trauma response right away, even if those people are literally just walking past you. So it's a very normal thing, I think, that people go through. But what I always say is it's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. So the trauma is abnormal, but the way that you react to it is very normal because it's not a natural thing to sort of happen. We don't deal with it, constantly all the time. It's that one event that ends up causing all of those thoughts and feelings.
I saw someone earlier on the live was talking about how sometimes you just sit and replay the situation in your mind, and then the same emotions still come up again. How does that person try to break that cycle of not just reliving the situation over and over again? Because it can be detrimental if you replay it. So how do you break that pattern, or how do you break out of that?
And that replaying is so common because it happens as a result of, in the moment when the trauma was happening, your brain didn't have time to process that information properly. So what happens after the trauma is your brain still tries to make sense of it. So it will replay it in order to be able to store it properly. So basically, our brains, now our conversation, our brains are listening, hearing, putting it where it needs to go. But in a trauma, there's no time for that. So what happens afterwards is we do replay it because your brain is still trying to package it in a way that makes sense. And remember, this is abnormal, so it doesn't make sense. So it's really important to just be mindful of that. Like, you need to be able to realize that, I'm going back into that, loop of like ruminating and thinking, and things like literally distracting yourself, phoning somebody, writing it down, like doing something to just break that cycle in that moment so that it doesn't become something that keeps happening over and over again. And also, when you write it down, like I said a little bit earlier on, it helps you to be able to process it, and you're more likely to be able to alleviate that constant replaying of this obviously terrible situation that happened to you.
But in the case of someone that's has gone through a rape ordeal, right? So they're replaying that in their heads. They're trying to make sense of it, but somehow they find a way to shift the blame onto themselves. How do you replay it and make sense of it without shifting the blame onto yourself? Like in situations like that, because we've read so many stories about women that have been raped or women that have been abused, right? And then it's like you find a way to shift the blame to yourself because you're trying to make sense of it. So in making sense of it, how do you still make sure that you see the reality of the situation and do not replay it in a way where you become the perpetrator, even though you're not?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with also just, and I try and help my clients go back to which is not easy, obviously, and it's not a very pleasant thing to sort of re-explain and sort of, try and let out again. But going back to on that day or in that situation, did you know that this was going to happen? And we can do this ourselves. You can ask yourself, like, when I woke up that morning, did I know that that was going to happen? Is there anything that I could have done? Not knowing what was coming, but almost like rationalizing it and doing a little bit of a reality check with yourself, or reality testing. What was the reality? What was the situation at that point in time? You did what you needed to do in order to survive that situation. So then, sort of trying to understand where that guilt is coming from, or understand where that blame, is going to and playing around with, what is it that you could have done differently? And often there's nothing that you would have done differently because you didn't know, so rather than understanding that you were in, and I hate saying the wrong place at the wrong time because that sort of simplifies it, and that's not what I mean, but you found yourself in a circumstance that was really unfortunate. It was just on that day, this thing decided to sort of happen, but could you have done anything differently about it? I think we need to be fair in thinking, I probably wouldn't have known, so I wouldn't have done anything differently.
So it's basically about replaying it in correct way, because sometimes it's basically like what you were saying about the fight or flight response. There was nothing else that you could have done more than what you did in that moment. And I think it's quite important for someone who's going through that to hear it. I have another question, or rather a message from one of the audience. She says, I was raped a few years back and it was a horrible experience. I got counseling, which helped. Something that bothered me at the time was that so many people around me who knew would often say, at least he didn't kill you, and that I should be grateful that I'm alive. But I don't feel like that. I feel like it downplays the rape. So as a person, let's say you are that person that was telling that person, just be grateful that he didn't kill you. What is the correct response? How do you help someone who's been through an ordeal like that? How do you respond correctly? Because I think sometimes when people are responding, there's this thing called toxic positivity, especially in a situation like that where you are trying to be positive about the situation, but this person has been raped. There's nothing positive about it. So what is the correct way to respond without actually making matters worse for that person and making them feel even more down than they do? Like, how do you respond to someone that has been raped, someone that has been abused? How do you respond properly as a loved one or as a friend?
I think most importantly is to not invalidate their feelings, right? And not invalidate the entire experience, actually. So saying, well, at least, this person didn't kill you, it basically invalidates everything else that I do feel, because I actually do feel like I was going to die, or I have struggled to get over this ordeal, so it's really important not to invalidate another person's experience. And you're right about the toxic positivity, where people will end up inevitably or indirectly downplaying a negative situation that someone may be going through, but really important to really just validate someone's experience. If someone is saying, I feel terrible that this happened and I still feel terrible, and I really was scared for my life, take it for what it is. That is that person's experience and their sort of outcome and the way that they have tried to make sense of it for themselves, and allowing them to talk about exactly what it is that they think and what they feel, without trying to justify anything else, without trying to make it seem like exactly what you said, it could have been so much worse, but it was really bad for me, and that's what I need you to hear. So I think it's important to support people where they are, rather than where we think they should be, rather than another person's story that we heard, and well, so-and-so actually ended up getting this, that, and this done to them. Really just meeting people where they are, I think, is really important.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think maybe the same principle should apply for people that have lost loved ones. I often hear people saying things are going to be okay, you'll be fine, but I feel like in that moment it invalidates how that person feels. So in the case of death, if you are at a funeral and trying to comfort someone, what is the best way to talk to that person in terms of trauma as well? Let's say it was a car accident, like you were saying, losing a loved one can be part of the trauma. How is the best way to speak to that person without invalidating how they feel in that moment?
I think just acknowledging it for what it is, to be honest. This is terrible, it's awful, I feel like my world is going to end, and that's what I need you to hear. I don't want to hear, well, at least you weren't there, or at least you've still got this person, or, over time, don't worry, over time, things will get better. People say that because they want to see you okay. I think sometimes distress makes people uncomfortable. So people say things because they just want the distress to go away, and they want you to be who I know you to be without all of this other stuff going on. So I think really just sitting with the person where they are, what they are actually going through. And most of the time, people just want you to listen. Sometimes people don't want you to say anything. They don't want you to say anything magical that's going to make them feel better. So just listening, and hearing, and just reflecting back what it is that they're saying to you. If someone is saying that they're having a really terrible day and they feel awful, acknowledging that it sounds like today is a really bad day, not okay, well, tomorrow will be better. That doesn't seem to help, So again, just meeting people where they are, I think really validates their experience, and they feel heard, and I think that helps with healing to some extent. People start to heal when they feel heard.
And I think it goes back to something profound that you said support people where they are, not where you think they should be. And I think that's quite important for everyone to know, because it helps in terms of not invalidating a person's feelings. Right now, currently, we're going through student protests, right? So I got a message here. Someone said it's been very difficult to watch the news lately with all the student protests. I remember how scary it was to be on campus a few years ago. Just watching it again on the news and social media has made me feel anxious and scared all over again. So in terms of, let's say someone was part of the Fees Must Fall protest, or like you said, was just seeing it on social media or in the media and has suffered from secondary trauma, what do you say to that person? Because it's still ongoing right now. People are being shot at, people are being hurt, people are being arrested. So if you're a person that was going through that or saw that and you are reliving it again, or you're traumatized, what do you say to that person now?
I mean, it definitely is a big trigger, and I think it's been going on for a while now. I think every year we sort of see the same patterns, and I think it can be very triggering for a lot of people. For someone, like that, I would really advise them to, first of all, just limit your intake of all of these things, and I think the same applies to just generally what's been going on with COVID and all of that. When things become overwhelming, just limit your intake, limit what it is that you are, consuming, literally, psychologically and emotionally. Not because you don't care, or not because, you're not interested or anything like that, but if you know that it's extremely triggering for you and affecting your mental and emotional health, to really just limit that. And also just, under the circumstances, I think just reminding yourself of right now at this point, you are safe. Right now, you are not that way. You are not in the middle of the trauma the way that you were back then, and just practicing strategies that are going to help you. Because when we're triggered, then your body goes back into that mode of survival and wanting to protect itself from something that it has perceived as a threat. So making sure that you're physically also helping your body just to regroup, because otherwise then things get going again, and you find yourself going through similar symptoms and experiencing similar things. So just making sure that you're bringing it back to the reality of, okay, but right now I'm okay, breathing exercise, looking after yourself, speaking to people, just making sure that you utilize resources that are there to actually assist you and help you to manage with those overwhelming moments.
So would that apply with that same thing or same strategy of actually just trying to overcome it every single day to someone that said, I rely on public transport to get to work, and a few weeks back I witnessed a horrible accident in front of us. Since then I'm too scared to use taxis again, but I have to use them in order to get to work. I feel so anxious and I feel like I can't breathe when I get into a taxi. So are there any breathing exercises that you can help that person with, or any advice that you can give that person with?
It will be hard for me to sort of go into detail with breathing exercise now, but there are so many. If you just look up, breathing exercises, there are apps now that help with breathing exercises and relaxation exercises. And what the point of those is to, as I said, bring your body back down to a bit of a more manageable state, right? So that your anxiety isn't through the roof. So, every morning waking up and doing a breathing exercise just brings that anxiety down to a point where it is manageable and you can do what you need to do. Getting into the taxi, starting to feel your heart beating fast and getting scared, just listening to music, phone somebody, do, deep breathing, read something, anything that's going to allow you to be in the situation, but without your anxiety going through the roof again. So just sort of going into a habit of when you're in that situation, not sitting there and thinking, oh my God, what if another accident happens? What if this happens, this, that, and the other? But rather, bringing yourself to the space that is a little bit more manageable until you can remove yourself from the situation. I'm making it sound easier than it is. I know that it isn't, and it takes a while to get to that point where you can manage your anxiety symptoms, especially if you have no choice but to stay in those situations. It takes a while and it takes practice, but eventually it gets to a point where you find it easier to manage and you realize that, okay, that accident was on that day, and it won't necessarily happen every single time I get into a taxi. But that feeling is very real, and I think it can be very overwhelming, especially right at the beginning after it's just happened.
No, thank you so much. Those are all the audience questions that we have. But I think just to recap on something that you said, for people that are struggling to access counseling or even therapy, you can journal, just get the thoughts out. I think that was quite an important thing that you said. And for those that are trying to support loved ones who are struggling with trauma and PTSD, I loved when you said support people where they are, not where you think they should be. I think more often than not, there's this toxic positivity where we try to make people okay because it makes us comfortable when they're okay, and it makes us uncomfortable when they're not okay. So we try to get them to a point where they're okay so we can just be comfortable and see and live in a state of positivity. But people are going through a lot. I think we expect too much of one another. We expect way too much of one another to a point where it can feed into that person's struggle. So I loved when you said support people where they are, not where you think they should be, because you don't know, you could be saving a life, which you could be telling a person one thing, that everything is going to be okay, but then you're invalidating how they feel in that moment. So it's quite important for us to just be cognizant of the things that we say to one another, because you don't know what the next person is going through. And to everyone who's watching, there's so many different avenues to get help. There's therapy, but if you can't get to therapy, again, please journal, please get the thoughts out, please relinquish the power from whatever's bothering you inside. But I think we all have just a collective responsibility to be kind to one another, because you don't know what a person is going through. Like you said, PTSD can go over like a long period. You never know when you're triggering someone without even realizing it. So it's quite important for us to be kind to one another. Reabetsoe, thank you so much for this conversation. I think it helped a lot of people, because we're living in such scary times, and we have been for quite a while. And a lot of people had a lot of questions to ask, especially with regards to trauma and just PTSD. Like when you spoke about how sometimes you could be walking and you could see people approaching you, especially as a woman, right? Like you could be walking, if you see a group of men approaching you, you literally get into that mode of flight or fight. And it's quite important, like you said, to have breathing exercises to just come back to reality as well. So thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, and have a good evening.
You too. Bye. Thank you so much for watching, guys.